Welcome as we share together in some words from the prophet Jeremiah and from the Gospel of Luke. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, a tree growing along the shoreline by a lake or the river, a stream. Its roots nourished by the water and the rich soil, the filtered sunlight absorbed in its leaves. It's an image of satisfaction, of contentment, of peace. It flourishes because it has all that it needs. This is the image that the passage in Jeremiah depicts of those whose lives are created or centered in trusting in God's abiding presence and faithfulness. That image comes to mind in the beginning of the reading of Luke in relationship to Jesus. He had just come down from the mountain and was once again surrounded by the crowds that regularly came to see him, to be in his presence wherever he went. We are told that the passage actually reads, we are told that all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. It's a pretty amazing statement. Jesus radiated this compassion and love. His presence glowed with contentment and peace. He was like Jeremiah's image of that tree, pulling in this energy from the water, the ground, the sunlight. Continually, we find that Jesus would take a break from the crowds to be in solitude, to be in contemplation, to be in prayer, a place where he could fill himself up, who would regularly fill his spirit with nourishment so that he could expend it touching the lives of others. And that image is to be for us an example of how we might also find inner strength and harmony, grounding ourselves in God's goodness, not merely because it fills us, but because it connects us. And connection is what the gospel is all about. God's Spirit at one with ours, and ours with God and with one another. It is the flow of love that circles around and around, filling and pouring out and filling again. It is the tree that takes in and releases and takes in again in a cycle of continuity and fulfillment. It's a beautiful image. It's a peace-filled image. It's what we are after all, right? Tranquility, satisfaction, meaning, purpose, fullness. It would be good to meditate on that for a while. Such is the life God desires for us to know as individuals and as a community across the globe. It is what we talk about in church. It is what we say we believe. It is what we pray about. It's what we strive to achieve, what we reach for. But if we're honest with ourselves, it is also hard to stick with. When children are born, they are pretty easy to please. As long as their basic needs are filled, they are content, though filling those needs as parents can be really exhausting. But essentially, if they are physically and emotionally nourished, they're happy. Yet, over time, things change. As the world opens up to us, our perspectives widen, and the human psyche yearns for more and more, believing that possession and consumption of things will bring us happiness. And even when we know deep down that things don't really bring joy, we get caught up in the materialism of our world that tells us, yes, they do. And we struggle with the need to have things in order to feel satisfied. A need to have more because it makes us feel secure. Isn't that essentially the philosophy behind storage units and pods? They do serve good purpose, that I know. But I wonder how many of them are filled with things that we can't let go of, because keeping them brings a sense of satisfaction in ownership, a peace of mind in knowing that it's there just in case it's needed. I use needed, but true need is more often not the case. Our attics, our basements, our closets, if we have them in our homes, might be very much like those units. Ownership of things tends to make us feel on some level, secure in that we won't come up short someday. This idea of possession, of having, of satisfaction, these are the very things that Jesus challenged his followers with. Instead, he points out that these are actually more of a curse. So he lays that out in woes, which we have heard Bill read for us today from the passage in Luke. And he says, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full now, for you will be hungry. Woe to you who are laughing now, for you will mourn and weep. Woe to you who speak, woe to you when all speak well of you. For that is what their ancestors did to the false prophets." Those words, hard to hear. Those words stood in complete contrast to many of the leaders in Jesus' day. Importance and status was measured by how much one had and how well one was fed, how their basic needs were provided. And such security brought satisfaction and false praise from those who considered wealth a product of right living. Let's be real, that's still very much true today. And it is to that point that Jesus speaks and turns that notion on its head. Right living, faithful living, is not rewarded with material wealth or having all that we need. That is a deception. Right living, faithful living, is a life that recognizes its dependence on the fullness of others, that we are bound together in order to know true contentment and joy. It is not so much that being rich is a bad thing, but it's the perception one has of one's wealth. Is wealth valued for the status that it brings, the pleasures of life it offers, or the opportunities that it allows to do good in the world? The ultimate truth is that we will only know true wealth and satisfaction when we accept and embrace our interconnectedness with our brothers and sisters across the human race, no matter how similar or how different they may be, as well as the relationships that we share, as the indigenous would say, with our non-human relatives, animals and plants, all of us together in this place that we call home. So it is that Jesus showers words of blessing on what at first glance might seem like the most unlikely people, the poor, the hungry, the sorrowful, the despised. These must have been sweet words to hear from the majority of the crowd that gathered around Jesus. Their plight recognized, their oppression promised relief, their brokenness healed. It is no wonder they continued to flock around him. His words were music to their ears. His acknowledgement of their circumstances alone brought hope. And it is true. Yet Jesus' message was more than replacing poverty with material wealth and hunger with all-you-can-eat opportunities. Jesus' message has been and continues to be about realizing the value of dependence, interdependence. While the crowds may have longed to have Jesus' words indicate they're reaching a wealth and a status that the leaders of their day possessed, Jesus was rather talking about a leveling of the playing field, that all would be on equal ground, all would benefit from one another, all would see themselves as parts of a greater whole. It's an interesting story, this story told in the book of Matthew, where Jesus, delivering the message of the blessings and the woes that we heard in Luke, often called the Beatitudes. In Matthew's story, it's depicted to be taking place on a mountaintop, more likely a hillside. But in Luke, it is not so. Rather, it takes place on the plain after Jesus has descended from the mountaintop. And so it is often called the Sermon on the Plain instead of the Sermon on the Mount. It could not be more appropriate that Luke puts Jesus in that setting, for clearly demonstrates the essence of his message. The blessings of life are derived from the awareness of our interdependence. We are rather mutually in need of each other for the fullness and well-being of life. What this means for us is that we begin to take notice of the ways our lives are interwoven together, that we pay attention to how much richer our lives become when we learn from each other, that we see the ways our perceptions become more inclusive and our hearts more open when we see past our differences, that we discover the wealth of spirit, the richness of soul, the fullness of our lives when we witness ourselves in the midst of this amazing world in which we live, and the diversity that gives us all strength and harmony, like a song sung in different parts and with different voices, yet lifted up as one. This week I wrote a piece on my relationship with the Mohegan tribe in Connecticut, as I reflected on the importance of our coming together as a people, diverse and yet similar, bound together as with a braided rope made of individual strands, but made stronger together than apart. Before we moved to Maine, I served the Mohegan Congregational Church in Uncasville, Connecticut. The historical significance of that church is that its establishment enabled the Mohegan tribe to remain in spite of the 1830 Indian Removal Bill enacted by President Andrew Jackson. 2 Mohegan women gave a plot of tribal land that they had inherited for the purpose of building a church, and it was established in 1831. That act and their resilience would ultimately bring them sovereignty. Recently, one of the elders stated the truth about the church. The cross was the proof we had become humanized and Christianized. The elders, he goes on, put an eagle feather in front of it so that they could always remember that this was ours, and we are going to believe and have our spirituality the way we want it. That eagle feather was there during my ministry, and I was often told the story of one pastor who in arrogance decided to remove the feather and discovered that it was he that was removed. The eagle feather serves in that place as a symbol of strength, purity, and high ideals, and reminds us of the universal sisterhood and brotherhood that brings us all together. It was a unique relationship being the pastor of a Christian church owned by the Mohegan tribe, and one in which tribal members and non-natives came together in a spirituality that had woven into it respect, honor, harmony, support. There was a deep sharing from which we all grew in community, one with another. And I, for one, am better for it, having come face to face with the wrongs of our past and worked side by side toward building a better tomorrow. That relationship emphasized the significance of our interconnectedness, for if suffering happened to one, we all felt its impact. Likewise, when sovereignty came to our Mohegan neighbors, the entire community benefited in countless ways. May we not underestimate the true blessings of this life that we discover when we open our hearts, when we open our minds, when we open our souls to the indwelling of God's Spirit in everyone. And when we do, we will discover the richness of life and be wealthier for it. May it be so.